The winter of 1873 hit the Montana frontier with a force that felt almost merciless. Snowstorms arrived early and stayed longer than expected, swallowing mountain passes, freezing rivers into silent glass, and isolating every scattered homestead like tiny islands in a white ocean. For Eliza Harper, each passing day felt like another test she wasn't sure she could survive. Just months earlier, her life had collapsed when her husband, Daniel Harper, was killed in a logging accident deep in the forest. Since then, Eliza had been left alone to raise 3 children in a remote mountain valley where help was miles away and winter never showed kindness. At 32, she was no longer the woman who had once dreamed of building a peaceful life on frontier land. Now she was a widow, fighting to keep that dream from being erased completely. Her children had become both her strength and her responsibility. Samuel, her 12-year-old son, had grown quiet and serious far too quickly. He worked beside her without complaint, hauling wood, repairing broken tools, and trying to fill the space his father left behind. Grace, 8 years old, tried to stay hopeful, often helping her younger brother Eli, who still believed his father watched over them from the stars. But hope alone did not keep a homestead alive. Food stores were shrinking, animals were dying from cold, and every storm seemed to chip away at their fragile existence. Then there was Silas Grady. A wealthy and ruthless cattle baron, Silas owned most of the surrounding territory. He had been pressuring Eliza to sell her land for months, convinced that her husband's death had made her vulnerable. This land, however, meant everything to her. It held Daniel's memory, their shared sacrifices, and the only future she could still offer her children. Silas did not see it that way. On one of his visits, he stood on her porch like a man who already owned the place. "Winter will break you," he said calmly. "Everything breaks eventually." Eliza stood firm despite the fear tightening her chest. "Not this family," she replied. Silas left without another word, but his silence felt like a promise of future danger. Days later, a violent blizzard swept across the valley, cutting off visibility and trapping the family inside for nearly 2 days. When it finally eased, Eliza realized something terrifying. Their firewood supply would not last much longer. With no choice, she took Samuel and went into the nearby forest to gather fallen timber. The snow was deep enough to slow every step, and the cold cut through their clothing like knives. The world around them was quiet, except for the wind. Then Samuel stopped suddenly. "Ma, look." Half buried near a broken ridge of pine trees was something that did not belong to the landscape. A human arm. Eliza's heart froze. Together, they rushed forward, digging through the snow with bare, freezing hands. Beneath the frozen layer lay a massive man, nearly swallowed by the storm. He was dressed in torn buckskin and heavy furs. His face was pale, lips blue, and his body covered in old wounds and fresh injuries. One leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. He was dying, but still alive. "Is he gone?" Samuel whispered. Eliza checked his pulse with trembling fingers. A faint beat answered her touch. Her decision came instantly. "We take him home." Despite their own survival struggles, Eliza and Samuel dragged the unconscious mountain man back through the storm. That night, Grace and Eli watched in shock as the stranger was laid near the fire. Eliza didn't know his name. She didn't know his past. But she knew one thing clearly. If they left him in the snow, he would die. So she chose to save him. And unknowingly, she brought change into her home that would reshape every part of their lives. The mountain man slowly came back from the edge of death inside Eliza Harper's small cabin. At first, he was nothing more than silence and pain. Fever burned through him for days, and his body refused to obey even the simplest commands. Eliza worked tirelessly, cleaning wounds, replacing bandages, and forcing down whatever food they could spare into his weakened body. Every day was a gamble. If infection spread, he would die. If fever worsened, he would never wake again. But Eliza refused to give up on him. She had already lost too much in life. The least she could do was refuse to let another human being die when she had the power to help. Slowly, the stranger began to recover. His breathing steadied, his fever broke, and one morning, his steel-gray eyes opened for the first time. The moment he woke, instinct took over. His hand moved toward a weapon that wasn't there. His body tensed, as if expecting attack. Eliza stepped closer but stayed calm. "You're safe," she said quietly. The man's eyes locked onto hers, sharp and suspicious. His voice was rough, almost broken. "Where am I?" Eliza didn't hesitate. "My home." A long silence followed. Then he asked the question that revealed everything about him. "Why would you bring me here?" Eliza looked at him with steady honesty. "Because leaving you outside would have meant death." The answer unsettled him more than any threat could have. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand a kind of logic he had never been taught. Finally, he spoke his name. Jeremiah Cross. And just like that, a stranger became part of their world. Jeremiah's recovery was slow, but every day he grew stronger. As his strength returned, so did his awareness of the family around him. He quickly noticed how little they had. Food was rationed carefully. Firewood was limited. Clothing was patched repeatedly. Yet despite this, Eliza always ensured her children ate first. That detail stayed with him. Samuel watched Jeremiah closely at first, unsure whether to trust him. But curiosity soon replaced fear. Jeremiah's knowledge of survival, tracking, and wilderness living fascinated the boy. Grace, gentle and observant, slowly warmed to him, asking questions about the mountains and animals he had encountered. Little Eli followed him everywhere, completely unafraid. For the first time in years, Jeremiah found himself surrounded by something he had long abandoned: human connection. As he regained strength, Jeremiah began helping the family in small ways. He repaired broken tools, carved wooden toys for Eli, and fixed traps for Samuel. Eliza noticed something unusual about him. He was not just a drifter. He thought like a trained man, a builder, a strategist, a survivor shaped by far more than simple wilderness hardship. One evening, as firelight flickered across the cabin walls, Eliza finally asked him the question she had been holding back. "You didn't come from the mountains, did you?" Jeremiah hesitated. Then slowly, he began to speak. He had once been a landowner in Wyoming Territory, a man with property, cattle, and a future. But after his father's death, everything changed. His own brothers betrayed him. They forged documents, aligned with corrupt men, and arranged an ambush that left him for dead in the mountains. They stole everything: his land, his identity, and his life. "I survived," he said quietly. "But survival isn't the same as living." Eliza understood that kind of loss more than she expected. Outside forces were already tightening around her own life, in the form of Silas Grady. And as Jeremiah healed within her home, something dangerous was also beginning to grow outside it. A storm that would soon force them all to stand and fight. By the time the worst of winter began to loosen its frozen grip on the Montana frontier, Eliza Harper had changed in ways she scarcely recognized. Only months earlier, she had been a grieving widow, barely holding her shattered life together after her husband Daniel's death. She had spent each day simply trying to survive, protecting her children, preserving their land, and resisting the relentless intimidation of Silas Grady. But survival was no longer enough. Now, with Jeremiah Cross standing beside her, something stronger had awakened inside her: determination. Jeremiah's presence at the Harper homestead had transformed more than the broken fences and failing farm. He had helped rebuild confidence, discipline, and resilience within the family itself. Under his guidance, 12-year-old Samuel Harper had become sharper, stronger, and more capable than ever before. Jeremiah trained him daily in hunting, tracking, firearm safety, and situational awareness. "Strength isn't about muscle," Jeremiah often told him while showing him how to read tracks in snow. It's about preparation. Samuel absorbed every lesson with fierce dedication. Grace, too, flourished. Jeremiah taught her wilderness medicine, herb gathering, and emergency survival skills, while Eliza ensured her daughter retained her compassion despite the harshness surrounding them. Even little Eli, though still young, learned basic caution and courage. For the first time since Daniel's death, the Harper children no longer lived solely in fear, and neither did Eliza. Jeremiah worked tirelessly to strengthen every vulnerable point on the property. He rebuilt perimeter fencing with reinforced timber. He installed concealed alarm lines using bells and wire around key entry points. He created hidden supply caches in case of siege. He mapped defensive positions and escape routes through nearby woods. Years of surviving betrayal and mountain wilderness had sharpened Jeremiah into something far more dangerous than Silas Grady realized. Silas, however, remained blinded by arrogance. To him, Eliza Harper was still merely a poor widow delaying the inevitable. That misjudgment would soon cost him. One bitter morning near late February, Eliza discovered clear evidence that Silas's men had crossed onto her land during the night. Several fence posts had been torn down, livestock feed had been spoiled, and worst of all, one of their milk goats had been slaughtered and left near the barn, a cruel warning. Grace burst into tears at the sight. Samuel's fists clenched in helpless rage, but Eliza's sorrow quickly hardened into fury. Silas was no longer simply threatening her livelihood. He was terrorizing her children. Jeremiah examined the scene carefully, his expression cold and calculating. 3 riders, he said after inspecting tracks. Maybe 4. They wanted to frighten you. Eliza's jaw tightened. Then they succeeded. Jeremiah turned to her, his steel-gray gaze unwavering. No, he said firmly. We prepare. Fear only wins if it changes your course. Eliza met his stare. For the first time, she realized she no longer wanted merely to endure Silas Grady. She wanted to defeat him. That evening, Jeremiah gathered Eliza and Samuel at the table. Silas believes pressure will break you, he explained. Men like him count on weakness, isolation, and despair. He spread a rough map of the property across the wood. So we become none of those things. Together, they developed a true defense strategy. Samuel would monitor the ridge trail. Jeremiah would patrol outer boundaries. Eliza would oversee supply security and coordinate with neighboring settlers. For Eliza, this marked a profound transformation. She was no longer reacting to danger. She was preparing for war. In the following weeks, Silas escalated his aggression. His riders appeared more frequently near property lines. Rumors spread in nearby settlements that Eliza Harper's land would soon be seized. Local merchants, many fearful of Grady's power, became hesitant to trade with her. But Jeremiah anticipated every move. When thieves attempted to steal livestock under cover of darkness, Jeremiah intercepted them in the woods, using stealth and mountain expertise to disarm and humiliate them without bloodshed. The battered men returned to Silas with a clear message. The Harper homestead was no longer defenseless. Word spread quickly across neighboring farms. Many settlers who had quietly suffered under Silas's exploitation began taking notice. Eliza, once viewed as a vulnerable widow, was becoming a symbol of resistance. Soon, neighboring families approached her discreetly. The Turners had lost pasture land through forged debt claims. The Holloways had been violently pressured into unfair sales. The McCready family had endured repeated sabotage similar to Eliza's. A disturbing pattern emerged. Silas Grady had built much of his empire not through honest business, but through systematic intimidation, fraud, and violence. For Jeremiah, these revelations struck deeply. Silas's corruption mirrored the very greed that had destroyed Jeremiah's former life. And as Jeremiah investigated further, he uncovered an even darker truth. Silas had connections to the same powerful business syndicate that had once conspired with Jeremiah's brothers to steal his inheritance. The realization was staggering. Their battles were intertwined. Silas Grady was not merely Eliza's enemy. He was part of the broader corruption that had ruined Jeremiah years ago. For Jeremiah, protecting the Harper family was no longer just a debt of gratitude. It was personal. One evening, Jeremiah shared his findings with Eliza. "This goes beyond your land," he said gravely. "Silas is tied to men who've been stealing from families for years." Eliza absorbed the weight of this. "How many?" Jeremiah's face darkened. "Too many." Silence filled the cabin. Then Eliza spoke with newfound certainty. "Then we stop him." Jeremiah studied her carefully. Gone was the frightened widow he had first met. In her place stood a frontier woman, forged by hardship, motherhood, and justice. For the first time, Jeremiah allowed himself a faint smile. "That," he said, "is exactly what I hoped you'd say." As winter finally began surrendering to early spring, the Harper homestead transformed into something extraordinary. Not merely a farm, not merely a refuge, but the foundation of rebellion against tyranny. Eliza organized nearby settlers quietly, building alliances. Jeremiah trained willing men in defense and strategy. Samuel emerged as a capable young protector. Grace documented testimonies from exploited families. Even Eli, in his innocent way, became a symbol of hope. Silas Grady had spent years preying on isolated weakness. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had pushed Eliza Harper too far, and in doing so, he had unknowingly united the very people he had oppressed. The widow he sought to crush was becoming the leader who could destroy him. By the time early spring began melting the snow from the Montana mountains, the Harper homestead no longer looked like the same fragile place it had been months earlier. What had once been a struggling widow's last hope was now turning into something far more powerful, a fortified stronghold built on trust, resilience, and quiet preparation for conflict. Eliza Harper had changed again. The woman who once hesitated at every decision was now steady under pressure. Hardship had carved something unbreakable into her spirit. Losing her husband had broken her heart, but surviving Silas Grady's constant threats had sharpened her will. And standing beside her through all of it was Jeremiah Cross. Jeremiah was no longer just a man recovering from near death. He had become the backbone of their defense, the unseen shield between Eliza's family and the growing danger surrounding them. But even as their homestead grew stronger, the threat outside was reaching a breaking point. Silas Grady had grown impatient. For months, he had expected Eliza to collapse under pressure. Financial strain, isolation, fear, and winter hardship were usually enough to force settlers into surrender. But Eliza Harper had not broken. That made her dangerous in his eyes. So Silas escalated. His men no longer stayed at the edges of the property. They crossed boundaries openly now, cutting fences, frightening livestock, and leaving deliberate signs of intimidation. One morning, Eliza found their barn door forced open and feed ruined beyond recovery. Grace stood silently beside her, trying not to cry. Samuel's fists were clenched so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Eli, too young to understand fully, still sensed something wrong in the air. Eliza looked at the destruction, and for the first time, something inside her shifted. Fear was no longer the strongest emotion. Anger was. Jeremiah examined the tracks left behind in the snow. 4 riders, he said calmly. They were sending a message. Eliza turned to him. What message? Jeremiah's expression hardened. That they believe you will eventually surrender. Eliza looked toward the broken barn. They're wrong. That single sentence marked a turning point. Jeremiah studied her carefully, recognizing the change. She was no longer asking how to survive. She was asking how to win. That night, Jeremiah spread a rough map across the wooden table inside the cabin. The fire crackled behind them as he pointed out terrain, routes, and blind spots. Silas doesn't just use force, Jeremiah explained. He uses isolation. Break people down until they believe they have no options. Eliza listened closely. Jeremiah continued. So we remove his advantage. He began outlining a plan, not just defense, but structure, coordination, prepared resistance. Samuel would monitor ridge paths and report movement. Jeremiah would patrol outer boundaries and reinforce weak points. Eliza would manage supplies, communication, and contact with nearby settlers. For the first time, their survival became organized, intentional, strategic. Eliza was no longer just reacting to threats, she was preparing for confrontation. In the weeks that followed, Silas's pressure intensified. More riders appeared near their land. Local merchants began avoiding Eliza out of fear of Grady's influence. Silas was tightening his grip. But Jeremiah anticipated every move. When a group of hired men attempted a nighttime raid on their livestock, Jeremiah intercepted them silently in the forest. There was no gunfire, no chaos, only control. By morning, the intruders had retreated, humiliated and shaken, carrying a message back to Silas that the Harper homestead was no longer easy prey. Word spread quickly across nearby settlements. Something had changed at Eliza Harper's land. And slowly, something even more important began to happen. Other settlers began reaching out. Quietly at first, then more openly. Families who had suffered under Silas Grady's influence, land seizures, false debts, intimidation, began sharing their stories. The Turners had lost grazing land through forged contracts. The Holloway family had been forced into unfair sales. Others spoke of burned fences, stolen livestock, and threats they never reported. A pattern emerged. Silas Grady was not just a landowner. He was a system of control, and Eliza was standing at the center of its resistance. Jeremiah, meanwhile, made a discovery that changed everything. While investigating Silas's operations, he found links between Grady's network and the same corrupt businessman who had once worked with his own brothers in Wyoming. The same betrayal that had destroyed his life. It was not coincidence, it was connection. Silas Grady's empire was part of the same corruption that had stolen Jeremiah's past. One evening, Jeremiah shared this with Eliza inside the cabin. The people behind him have been doing this for years, taking land, destroying families, covering their tracks. Eliza sat quietly, absorbing the weight of it. "How many families?" she asked. Jeremiah's voice lowered. "More than you can imagine." Silence filled the room. Then Eliza spoke with steady certainty. "Then we don't just defend anymore." Jeremiah looked at her. "What do we do?" Eliza's eyes were firm. "We expose him." For a moment, Jeremiah said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "That's how wars begin." But Eliza did not flinch. "Then let it begin." From that moment forward, everything shifted. Eliza began quietly gathering testimony from neighboring families. Samuel learned to track movement patterns and relay messages. Grace recorded details of incidents with surprising precision. Even Eli, in his innocent way, became a symbol of what they were fighting to protect. Jeremiah trained others who were willing, men who had once suffered in silence, now learning how to stand together. Silas Grady had spent years isolating people so they could be controlled. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had pushed them far enough to unite. And at the center of that unity stood Eliza Harper, a widow who was no longer just surviving her world, but beginning to change it. By the time the final winter snows fully retreated from the Montana mountains, the Harper homestead no longer resembled the fragile, struggling property it once was. What had begun as a nearly broken widow's fight for survival had slowly transformed into something rare on the frontier. A place of strength, unity, and growing purpose. Eliza Harper stood outside one early spring morning, watching sunlight spill across the thawing valley. The same land that had once felt like a burden now felt like something else entirely. Protected, alive, and no longer alone. Behind her, the cabin was already bustling with activity. Samuel was repairing fencing with new confidence. Grace was organizing supplies with careful precision. Little Eli chased chickens across the yard, laughing for the first time in months without fear shadowing his voice. And at the center of it all stood Jeremiah Cross. Jeremiah was no longer a broken mountain drifter pulled back from death. He had become something far more anchored, a protector, a builder, a man slowly reclaiming the life that had once been stolen from him. But more than that, he had become part of the Harper family in a way none of them had expected. Silas Grady's downfall had begun earlier than anyone realized. With the growing network of settlers quietly united under Eliza and Jeremiah's coordination, evidence of Grady's illegal land seizures, forged debts, and violent intimidation had been systematically collected. What once seemed like isolated complaints had become undeniable proof of a larger corruption network stretching across the territory. Jeremiah's own discovery that Silas was connected to the same corrupt syndicate responsible for his family's betrayal years ago gave the fight even deeper weight. This was no longer just Eliza's battle. It was justice long overdue. When federal authorities finally arrived, they did so with warrants backed by testimony from dozens of settlers. Silas Grady, confident in his untouchable power for years, was arrested without the show of force he expected. For the first time, his influence failed him. The empire he built through fear began to collapse piece by piece. With Silas removed, the grip he had held over the region loosened almost overnight. Families who had lived under intimidation finally stepped forward freely. Land disputes were reopened, forged claims were investigated, and slowly, justice began to return to a place that had forgotten it. Jeremiah's personal truth also came full circle. With Silas's connections exposed, the corruption that had destroyed Jeremiah's former life in Wyoming was finally brought to light. His stolen inheritance was legally restored, along with the ranch and holdings his brothers had once taken from him. For Jeremiah, it was not just wealth returning, it was identity. Yet what surprised him most was what he chose to do with it. One evening, as the last snow melted from the hills, Jeremiah approached Eliza outside the barn. "I could leave," he said quietly, "start over somewhere else, rebuild everything I lost." Eliza looked at him carefully. "But you're not leaving," she said. Jeremiah nodded slowly. "No." He turned toward the homestead, where Samuel was working, Grace was tending garden seedlings, and Eli was laughing in the sunlight. "This is where I belong now." With his restored wealth, Jeremiah made a decision that changed everything. Instead of reclaiming his former life, he invested in the Harper homestead, expanding it, strengthening it, and turning it into something far beyond survival. New barns were built, livestock herds grew, fields were expanded and stabilized. What had once been a struggling patch of land became one of the strongest ranches in the region. But the most important transformation was not in land or structures. It was in people. Eliza Harper, once a grieving widow fighting alone, had become a leader, respected not through power, but through courage and persistence. She worked beside Jeremiah in every decision, her voice now carrying weight among neighboring settlers. And slowly, something deeper formed between them. It did not arrive suddenly. It grew through shared hardship, trust earned in silence, and countless moments of standing side by side when it would have been easier to fall apart. It was not romance born of convenience. It was something built through survival. The children noticed it first. Samuel saw how Jeremiah always stood slightly closer to Eliza when danger was near. Grace noticed how Eliza softened when Jeremiah returned from long patrols. Even Eli, in his simple way, began calling Jeremiah family without hesitation. Together they created more than a ranch. They created a refuge. A place where widows, orphans, and struggling settlers could find safety when the frontier offered none. Families began arriving quietly, seeking help after losing land or facing threats. Others came with stories of loss, similar to Eliza's own. And none were turned away. What began as one woman's act of mercy, saving a dying mountain man in the snow, had grown into something far larger than anyone could have predicted. A network of protection. A rebuilding of broken lives. A legacy rooted not in wealth or power, but in compassion and resilience. One evening as the sun set over the mountains and painted the sky in deep orange and gold, Eliza stood beside Jeremiah outside the ranch. The wind was softer now, the valley quieter. Peace no longer felt distant. Jeremiah looked out across the land. "If you hadn't found me in that storm," he said quietly, "none of this would exist." Eliza shook her head slightly. I didn't save you, she replied. We saved each other. Jeremiah turned to her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Because some truths did not need words. Behind them, laughter carried from the house. Life, real life, had finally returned. And what began in a frozen mountain storm had become something enduring, a legacy of mercy that changed not just one family, but an entire frontier.